Hello and welcome to the Hershey History Center. There was a trolley tour that was held on April 25th, 2026, that toured sites of Hershey relating to World War II history. I'm Ted Herman. I led that tour, and we're going to be recreating that today. And today is actually May 8th, 2026, which is VE Day. It's the day that celebrated across the world is the ending of World War II in the European theater. And so it's very fitting that we're here today to talk about that. My family's involvement is something that I'm sure mirrors so many people's. I had both grandfathers and 8 great uncles who were World War II veterans, and even my grandmother, who was a worker in war industry. And everyone's story, talking about World War II, is unique and distinct. And no matter where they were, they sacrificed. My one grandfather was a little bit older. He was drafted at age 30. My other grandfather was drafted. He was still in high school at age 18, got a deferment for several weeks to actually graduate. And 2 days later, he was on a train to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. He saw combat, went overseas. Some never did that. Some never left the States. Some came from big towns, small towns, but they all contributed no matter where they were from. The U.S. population in 1941 was 131 million, and 16 million of those served in uniform. Almost everyone at the time had skin in the game. There were 400,000 U.S. killed during the war, and of those, only 250,000 were battle deaths, meaning 1/3 were actually killed in accidents or in training. So no matter where they served, they were in danger. An additional 671,000 were wounded, my grandfather being one of those. And as I mentioned, 81 years ago is VE Day. In April of 1945, U.S. troops were on Okinawa in the Pacific. They were fighting in Germany, in Europe, and both of those battles were actually the bloodiest of the war. There were 10,000 Americans that would die in Germany, and 13,000 Americans were killed on the island and in the waters around Okinawa. The war was brutal and bloody to the very end. Historian Rick Atkinson said that the difference in the United States winning the war was our allies. Stephen Ambrose noted that the difference was the young men who showed courage and initiative and rose to the occasion. In truth, it was probably some of both. And what we're going to do now is dive into some of those stories. We're going to talk about early war, and I'll see you at our next stop. As I mentioned, the United States military grew to have 16 million men and women in uniform. And during the early part of the war, in 1940 and 1941, after Germany invaded Poland, the United States ramped up not just production, but military strength in those 2 years. They were seeing the clouds of war forming. We were trying to prepare as best we could. In 1939, the U.S. Army stood at 190,000 troops, which was less than military superpowers Romania and the Netherlands. And by 1941, we had already risen from 190,000 to 1.8 million. And we're standing here, which is on Pat's Hill. We have the Hotel Hershey behind me. And Hotel Hershey was constructed between 1931 and May of 1933. It was a 170-room hotel at the time. It was built by the Hershey Lumber Company. Now, Pat's Hill, where we're standing, is significant as the highest point in Hershey. It had been utilized first in 1914 by the Hershey Water Company, which had installed 2 reservoirs on the backside. They're still there of the hotel. It was called Highland Park. It became a public picnic ground, and a trolley line ran up the hill as early as 1915. Now, if you were standing here in 1941, you would see the town behind you. It was a town at the time of 8,600 people. Today, it is 25,000. You would see the Rose Garden, you would see the Hershey Park pool and golf course. Hershey Park was established in 1906 as a picnic park. You would see places like the ballroom and the dairy. Milton Hershey had a experimental round barn just at the entrance of what is now Hershey Park called Broad Acres. The police academy, which sits to my left, would have not been up here until 1960. The Hershey outlets, which were constructed in the 1990s, and all of these were Milton Hershey, or at the time Hershey Industrial School's farm homes, and this area was actively being farmed. By the time we get into the early war, Hershey and Hotel Hershey specifically is going to play a big part in those early years. Now, beginning in 1941, as the United States entered the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it was really a mix at the time of paranoia with intense anger and outrage over the unprecedented attack on December 7th. One of the responses to those was to actually create several means for citizens to take up the defense of the homeland. So it's kind of similar to a home guard situation that had been in place in England for many years, following, again, the 1939 German invasion of Poland. But we have a couple things happening here. We have something called the Pennsylvania State Guard, which is going to take the place of the Pennsylvania National Guard, which was federalized in 1941. So they're out of the picture and not able to help with home defense. You have the Pennsylvania militia, and they're going to be, after Pearl Harbor, guarding rail yards, guarding factories, guarding things like railroad installations and bridges. You also have something called the Aircraft Warning Service, which is actually, before radar, you would actually have people in high places on hills or in areas like this. And of course, you have the towers behind me here that were the first Aircraft Warning Service reporting station in Hershey. They would have an observer up there with binoculars, aircraft recognition, and the idea was to track planes from post to post across the Commonwealth. And there were 1.6 million citizens that volunteered, from kids in high school all the way up to older adults that were too old for military service. There are 1,200 posts in Pennsylvania, and it was designed as a morale boost, participation, and really probably more symbolic than actual defense strategy. Now, I talked to several people many years ago who actually served in the Aircraft Warning Service here, including Marion Rice and Alma Bob. And they talked about the very first place that they used was Hotel Hershey Towers. They were here for 10 months. And the reason that they were only here for 10 months was because in November of 1942, Hotel Hershey became closed to the public as it transformed into a different military use. On November 7th, 1942, the United States, through Operation Torch, invaded North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria. And at that point in time, the United States had been in a diplomatic relationship with an area in southern France known as Vichy. Now, Vichy was self-governed. It was essentially a German puppet state, but it was allowed to be French governed through the Vichy regime. Several days after the November 7th invasion, Germany put troops in southern France as they were afraid that the United States and its allies would invade southern France as the next step to what had been operations in North Africa. At the time, the Germans arrested Douglas MacArthur II, the nephew of General Douglas MacArthur. He was secretary of the U.S. Embassy in Vichy and was put in an internment camp in Lourdes, France. Secretary of State Cordell Hull in the United States, in response, took the French ambassador, Gaston Henriet, and on November 17th, arrested the entire diplomatic corps of Vichy, France, and brought them here to the Hotel Hershey as general manager of the hotel at the time, a gentleman named Joseph Gathler, had actually offered the Hotel Hershey as an internment place for the Vichy officials. There were some 300 men, women, and children in the diplomatic corps and their families that were housed at the Hotel Hershey. They were offered the rate, the State Department was offered the rate at the hotel of $7.50 a day for adults and $4 a day for children and guards from the State Department. Now, the party of the Vichy French enjoyed the grounds, including the game room, the sun deck, horseback riding, golf course. They had movies. There were no phone privileges, and they were under guard. The hotel was actually closed to guests and was just exclusively a white-collar prison. So by September of 1943, the number of prisoners interred here at the Hotel Hershey had dropped significantly. There were only 30 prisoners left out of the original 300, really ardent Nazis who were still professing their loyalty to Vichy and the German government. The rest at that point in time had declared their allegiance to free France or had offered to help the United States diplomatically. The State Department at that point in time decided to move the prisoners to Warm Springs, Virginia, to a smaller facility, and eventually resulting in a prisoner exchange between Vichy France, where MacArthur was returned, in exchange for Henri A. and his party, and that exchange took place in 1944 in Lisbon, Portugal. Now, at the time, there is a documentation of Henri making the comment to MacArthur that, "My dear MacArthur, you have indeed lost a lot of weight." And I can only imagine what must have been going through MacArthur's mind, knowing that for the last several years he had been in a German internment camp in France, while the French party on the American soil had been feted in places like the Hotel Hershey. Our next stop is going to be Hershey Industrial School, and we'll pick up the story there. Standing here in front of what was known at the time as Senior Hall. This was constructed in 1934 to serve students at the time. It was called Hershey Industrial School. The successor is Milton Hershey School. And until 1934, all students that were enrolled in the school actually went to Hershey High School downtown. When this was opened, which was on the 25th anniversary of the Deed of Trust, it served grades 6 to 12. The Welcome to Hershey sign behind me was installed in 1960. It came back in 2007. This is now known as Catherine Hall and serves as Milton Hershey School's middle school. Now, at the time, I mentioned the Aircraft Warning Service moved in November of 1942 from the Hotel Hershey when that closed to inter the Vichy French officials. This is where it moved, to the clock tower of the Milton Hershey School. And it served there until May of 1944, when the threat of hostile activity in the United States became, next to none. And at that time, the AWS program was discontinued across the United States. Now, I want to talk about a couple of World War II veterans who served Milton Hershey School. One was a gentleman named Al Charles, who was a 1941 graduate of the school, taught or took machinist courses here, as they had a very vocational technical program here, which was important to Milton Hershey. He became an aircraft mechanic and machinist at Glen Martin in Baltimore, and didn't feel like he was doing enough, so enlisted in the United States Navy. He actually served as a gunner's mate on Omaha Beach, repairing ordnance and weaponry and putting that back into service after the invasion. He actually went into France on June 7th, 1944, the day after the Allied invasion. Ken had another graduate of Hershey Industrial School in 1941. He worked in the mailroom at Hershey Estates before enlisting in 1943. He served in the 397th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. And at the same time as Al Charles was on Normandy Beach, Ken Hatt was there as well. The floating docks that the Allies installed off of Omaha Beach called Mulberries actually had anti-aircraft artillery emplacements right on them to protect them from German aircraft. And Ken Hatt's unit was assigned to the Mulberries, protecting them from German air attack. Now, post-war, Ken returned to Hershey Estates and eventually became president of HE&R, the successor of Hershey Estates, in the 1980s, running the company and giving back to the school that had given him so much. And the last veteran from the class of 1941 is named Ralph Fink. Now, Ralph tried to enlist right after he graduated, but he actually was colorblind and was turned down. After a couple years, standards went down as the United States military needed men, and Ralph was able to enlist in 1943, served in the 45th Infantry Division, served in 7 campaigns, including 2 amphibious landings in North Africa, southern France, and finally, North Africa, Italy, and finally southern France. He was wounded twice, and he actually was in one of the first units to liberate the Dachau concentration camp. Now, Ralph came back and served military school for 51 years after the war, 30 years as a house parent and 21 years as a host at Founders Hall, fulfilling Milton Hershey's dream of service. Was a gentleman named Joe Gumfer. And Joe Gumfer graduated in a class of 1935, the first one to graduate from Senior Hall on the Hill. He worked at the Hershey department store and a Hershey lumber company, went to junior college, and eventually joined the United States Navy in 1942. Now, Joe served as a yeoman in naval intelligence, working in Washington, D.C. first, and eventually going to Hawaii and on to Guam. And after the war, he returned, got a job at the Hershey Bank, where he became cashier. He eventually rose to be president of the bank and also president of Hershey Trust Company. Brett Hancock was a Marine, and he was a 1934 graduate of Milton Hershey School, the last to graduate from Hershey High School. And Brent served in the 3rd Marine Division and was an aide to their commanding general, Hal Turnage. He actually fought on Guadalcanal, Bougainville, and Guam, and returned to Hershey, becoming a staple at the Hershey News as a publicist, and also in the press and PR department for the Hershey Bears in that capacity from the 60s until the 80s. He's a member of the Hershey Bears Hall of Fame, and he actually was noted for attending the very first Bears game at the arena and the very last Bears game held at the arena in 1938 and again in 2002. The last veteran I'm going to talk about is Bill Dearden, and Bill's a graduate of the Hershey Industrial School in 1940, was a sports star in basketball and football, attended Albright College, and actually enlisted in the Navy, becoming a dispersing and supply officer in the South Pacific aboard a fuel tanker. He came back after graduating, came back from the war, graduated from college, and eventually worked at first Milton Hershey School, and eventually became CEO of Hershey Chocolate Corporation in the 70s and 80s. The first, and at this point only, Hershey Industrial School graduate to run the chocolate company, which was a dream of Milton Hershey's. Now, there were 37 graduates of the Hershey Industrial School that were killed during World War II. And in addition to providing numerous veterans that served, they also served as a vocational training center in cooperation with Olmsted Air Base in Harrisburg, where they trained machinists in things like propeller repair, engine maintenance, and things of that nature, cooperating with the U.S. Army to utilize what was a training center here. And it was part of those things that really made Milton Hershey proud to not just to have the chocolate company be producing war materials, but to have other aspects of the town participating in the war effort. We're standing in Hershey in the site of what was known as Spatara Station during World War II. At this time, it was a separate community from Hershey. It had its own businesses, had its own culture and heritage. A lot of the immigrants from Italy that had come over here had worked in the nearby limestone quarries. And at that point in time, there were many villages around, like Gary Church, Hockersville, Bachmanville, that were all separate stops on trolley lines and railroad that would eventually grow together to become Hershey. It was known at the time as the Little Italy of Derry Township. And in 1942, when a lot of veterans started going into the service, Blue Star banners began appearing in windows of families that had veterans serving. In 1943, that focus shifted to community-wide memorials. And right here, where these bushes stand, was actually the very first honor roll representing a portion of Hershey. And then this was dedicated as a Guitar Station honor roll on September 4th of 1943. And by honor roll, it was simply a large patriotic board with decorations that had the name of each service member that was in either the Army, Navy, Marines, or Army Air Force listed on there. And service members were added to it as they enlisted. At the time of the dedication, there were 84 service members, men and women, who were serving on that board. 8 families had 3 children in the service, and an additional 8 had 2 in the service. So, Guitar Station had, as I mentioned, at the time of its dedication, 84 service members on that board. 2 that I'd like to highlight today. One of them was Louis Memmi, who, along with his brother Joseph and a third brother, August, were all in the military. Louis had worked at the hotel before going to Detroit to work in the airplane industry at the outbreak of the buildup in 1940 and 41 of the heavy industrial focus of the United States. After Pearl Harbor, he returned to Hershey and enlisted in the Army in February of 1942. One of the memories that he shared was going to Camp Wheeler, Georgia. And during his training, he was introduced to segregation for the first time, and it on the base, and he remembered how shocking that was to see in person. He fought on Guadalcanal, New Georgia, with the 25th Lightning Infantry Division. He contracted malaria multiple times and eventually returned to the United States. Berto Bacchini was the son of Italian immigrants from Pigilano in Italy, where his parents were both born. He lived on Chocolate Avenue, and he was married and had a son when he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was serving in the 10th Mountain Division, where on April 14th, 1945, in the Po Valley in Italy, he was wounded and died 11 days later on April 25th, and is currently buried in the Florence American Cemetery, just 2 hours from the ancestral home where his parents came from. So we're standing here in Guitar Station at the Italian Sons War Memorial. This was dedicated in 1957 and reads in commemoration of those who served our country. Now, one thing to think about with the honor rolls that were built in towns and communities during World War II, they were made of wood and were painted, but they weren't made to last years and years. So by the late 40s, most of them had deteriorated and were being replaced with permanent memorials, or simply were taken down. Now, this was dedicated, as I mentioned, Memorial Day 1957. It was on land that was donated by Major Thomas Martin, who actually was the superintendent of the State Police Academy in Hershey at the time, secured the land, and he was the father-in-law of Louis Memmi. The statue came from Italy. It cost just under $2,000 and was exclusively raised by community donations and local businesses. In the 60 years that this has been in place, it survived because of caretakers like Angelo Cialone and his son John, who has now taken over for him since Angelo passed away. They lived adjacent to the memorial, and they have been the caretakers of the grounds. For many decades, Debo Di Clementi coordinated the ceremony that's held here every Memorial Day. And with Tom Memmi, who is Lewis's son, has taken over that responsibility since Debo has passed away. And so you see that continuation, the heritage, how important it is to these small communities to continue to remember World War II veterans. We're standing in front of Hidden Still Spirits right now, which opened in 2021. However, this building, originally constructed as the extraction plant in Hershey, has its roots in World War II. The building was actually constructed in 1941 and began operations 6 days before Pearl Harbor was bombed. The purpose of the building was to take waste products like cocoa shells, hulls, something called expeller cake, leftover cocoa butter, and a byproduct called theobromine was extracted, which was used in drugs to treat heart and kidney ailments. They also, for many years, made cocoa butter soap here, as Milton Hershey's theme was efficiency, but also not having any waste, which really fit into the rationing and the conservation and recycling theme brought on by World War II. Now, as the reuse push happened here, it also continued for Hershey after the end of the war. And the other World War II connection to this building is it was actually operated for a time by Major Dick Winters. Now, in 1972, Dick Winters went into his own business of distributing vitamin products and food premixes for animals. And in 1979, he began contracting with Hershey Foods and actually purchased their waste candy byproducts, bars, nuts, pasta, cocoa, all those type of things, and was including that in his nutritional feed supplements. Well, he continued processing and renting space in this extraction plant, doing some 10,000 tons a year of these waste candy byproducts. And he operated here and had an office in this building until 1997 when he retired. Now, so many people know about Dick Winters and his military exploits. However, they don't really know a lot about not just his business leadership, but his philanthropic efforts, which he gave away tens of thousands of dollars to benefit community and veterans groups. The building behind me is known as the trolley barn or the car barn. And it was constructed in 1960. It was actually the third car barn that was used by the Hershey Transit Company. Now, that company was formed in 1910 and had trolley lines running all over the community and outside to places like Elizabethtown, Lebanon, connected with other lines that went all the way to Lancaster. It was originally used by Milton Hershey to transport milk and then later his workers to the factory, but also transported countless tourists to Hershey Park, children to schools in the area as well. It housed workshops, maintenance, and of course the actual trolley cars themselves. The Hershey History Center right now is working collaboratively with the Milton Hershey School to restore an original Hershey trolley, which is trolley number 7, that served the line from 1931 to 1946. Now, the reason this is related to World War II is the Hershey trolley was actually scheduled for closure in 1940. In fact, plans had been hatched in 1940 to discontinue the trolley lines the following year. The Hershey Transit Company had filed plans with the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission to shut down the lines, and that, because of wartime rationing, was not allowed by the PUC. They had allowed and encouraged public transportation, and really it was a lifeblood at that point in time because things were rationed, like not just gasoline and tires, but also, in many cases, no new cars were made during World War II because of all those resources going to war production. Now, the trolley finally ceased operations on December 21st of 1946. And at that point in time, the car barn was essentially converted over to house buses, which succeeded for a brief period of time. The trolleys, those were not very popular, and they actually were discontinued in just a couple of years. Since that point in time, the car barn has primarily been used for storage, and actually today it is owned and used by Hidden Still for storage of their products. We're standing in front of the Hershey Consolidated School, also known as Hershey Junior Senior High School on Granada Avenue. It's a combination of three buildings, the first of which was constructed in 1914 and consolidated all the small schoolhouses into one single building. Initially, it served grades 1 through 12 until 1924, when the second building behind me was constructed. And the two buildings were joined in 1928 by the middle section, which was a vocational school, and provided that link between all three. All buildings were paid for by Milton S. Hershey for the community. Now, we talked about the men and women entering the service as we got into the war, and U.S. military manpower was building up. It saw students increasingly being drafted right out of high school, and in some cases leaving school to enlist. It also wasn't just the students, it was the faculty. And it wasn't the military, it was also taking on different roles within the community to benefit the war effort, like the aircraft warning service, where students would go after school, or the factory, where especially female students were leaving school and going to work to support the war industry. A couple of veterans to highlight. Austin Geiling. Austin Geiling Jr. and Sr., a father and son from West Chocolate Avenue, were actually both in the military during World War II. Now, Austin graduated from this building, Hershey High School, in 1941, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps, served in the 4th Marine Division, made landings on Kwajalein and Saipan. He was wounded on D+1, June 16th, 1944, which was his 21st birthday. Punctured by a bullet through the shoulder into his lung, shattering a rib. He spent from June until February 1945 in a series of military hospitals. His father actually was the manager of DeAngelis Family Restaurant, currently where Fenici's is located, and was drafted at age 38 in 1944 and was sent to Fort Lee, Virginia, and put in charge of running their non-commissioned officers club. Another veteran to highlight was Harold Brandt. Harold graduated from Hershey High School in 1942, attended Hershey Junior College, and was drafted in July of 1943. Harold ended up as a rifleman in the 11th Armored Division, went overseas in October of 1944, and first went into combat in the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944. His unit was in combat for 128 consecutive days. Harold's older brother by 10 years, Marlon, was also in the military and was in the Quartermaster Corps at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, never going overseas. Now, the unique part of Harold's story is he actually came back after the war and was principal of the junior senior high school in the very same building where he graduated. Antoinette and Julia Camachi were sisters, born a year apart, put in the same class by their parents, and graduated together in 1943. They immediately went to work, both of them working in the Hershey Chocolate Factory. Julia stayed for 40 plus years, and she worked in the wrapping department during the war, packaging both the Army Ration D and tropical bars as they came off the production line. And she talked to me many years ago about the challenges they faced, not just in producing the bars, but in wrapping them and shipping them, because it was a whole new process to create for those bars. The last veteran I want to point out is John Hummer. Now, John was a faculty member. He was also a graduate of Hershey High School in 1933, went to Franklin and Marshall College, returned in 1938 to teach, and in October 1941, 2 months before Pearl Harbor, he volunteered for the peacetime draft, serving as a lieutenant in the 270th Field Artillery Battalion. He was a forward observer, or also known as a survey officer, in November of 1944 near the French-German border, and he was hit by a mortar round while calling and supporting fire for his artillery battalion, and was killed on November 15th, 1944, earning the Silver Star. These are just a few examples of service and sacrifice coming out of the building known as the Hershey Junior Senior High School. We're standing here at the Court of Honor in downtown Hershey, right in the square. And at the time of the war in the 1940s, this was the symbolic center of town, and really it still is. The community building was here, the chocolate factory was here. You have the Hershey Trust Company, Hershey Press Building, Hershey Fire Company, and this is the main area. We're standing on the spot of actually where the Cocoa Inn was at the time. Now, this is the third location for what is known as the Derry Township Court of Honor. The first location was actually in the courtyard of the Hershey Community Building. And this was the second community honor roll. The first one being Swatara Station, as we previously talked about. This one encompassed everyone in Derry Township. And at the time of its dedication on November 7th of 1943, there were 864 names on these signs. And again, in the courtyard, they're on wooden placards attached to the railing, and names are added as people continue to be, join the military. Now, this was also on the 25th anniversary of the ending of World War I. Many speeches were given. There were over 1,000 people that attended that dedication ceremony, and it was titled Court of Honor, Derry Township Defenders of America, and was sponsored by Post 386 of the American Legion. Reverend Morris, who was from the Lutheran Church at the time, stated that we are determined on the fighting fronts just as we are determined on the home front, to the end with our gallant allies until victory brings us peace. And it reflects the sentiment and just how much people in town, not just in the town of Hershey, but also all across the country, how they were dedicated to the war effort. Now, as I mentioned, this was the third location for the Derry Township Court of Honor. Dedicated at the community building in 1943, and the original wooden boards were actually replaced in the early 1950s by two bronze plaques with the names of over 1,000 World War II veterans, men and women who served the community. Memorial Day services continued to be held here until 1982, when the plaques were moved over to, at the time, it was called the Hershey Plaza, which was the new community center and recreation area. That was demolished as the Hershey Community Center was refurbished and expanded. And in 2024, the current Court of Honor in downtown Hershey was dedicated with those very same plaques that you see today. Standing here in front of the Hershey Company, which in the 1940s was known as Hershey Chocolate Company. And the story of Hershey being a provider of rations for the U.S. war effort begins in 1935, begins in the chemistry lab in this building, where a 34-year-old chief chemist named Sam Hinkle, along with a very interested 78-year-old Milton S. Hershey, worked with the Army Subsistence Laboratory and their director of subsistence, Colonel Paul Logan, to create what was now known as the Hershey D-Ration Bar. It started out as a desire by the Quartermaster Corps to create a ration that not only sustained troops, but was easy to carry, could be put in a soldier's pocket, was very nourishing, and provided sustenance when they couldn't actually get traditional rations and supplies to the troops. Now, Milton Hershey was always a presence in the laboratory, was very interested in these experiments, and it took them until 1937 to actually come up with a formula that was accepted by the U.S. Army. And it was really part of that strategy from between the wars where they wanted to update the rations that hadn't really changed since even before World War One. Not just the way soldiers were fed and supplied, but how those rations provided nutrients and made for a more pleasant experience in eating in the field, but also in preparing for the rigors of combat. Now, in addition to the actual uh, chemistry of the bar itself, everything had to be created from scratch, not just a way to make the products which didn't fit through a traditional molding machines because it wasn't viscous enough to go through the normal chocolate line, but also how to prepare, package, and get those items all around the world for our servicemen. Hershey Chocolate Factory, 19 East behind me, is in downtown Hershey. And I mentioned previously, we talked about the Hershey Community Building a little bit in the Court of Honor. All these things are happening right here in close proximity. And you have things like in the heart of town, the Victory Corps is a group of high school students that are conducting Red Cross bandage rolling. They are volunteering. They're promoting physical fitness, communities, supporting the war effort, conducting scrap drives. Boy Scouts are involved. There are collection points for recycled goods like rubber and scrap metal and all kinds of things that are critical to the war effort. Now, the Hershey Zoo closed, but the community building was intact and open. They were holding things like movies, and they were still trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. However, life was changing during war in downtown Hershey. In addition to developing the formula for the Ration D bar, Milton Hershey also had to completely change its manufacturing and the wrapping and shipping of bars. So, as I mentioned, the material and the product couldn't go through the normal extruding machines to be molded, so it had to be molded by hand. Hershey also had to come up with a way to seal the bars for shipment across 3,000 miles of open ocean. And one thing that they did at first was putting foil around the bars. Of course, that became a war material, so they had to overwrap them with parchment and things like glassine, eventually going from parchment into boxes. Eventually, using the brand new discovery of cellophane at the DuPont company to seal bars. So again, this is a constantly evolving thing. And when you think about the numbers that are produced, it was really staggering. There were 500 million ration D bars produced, 700 million tropical bars produced, and Hershey made 8 products in total for the war effort. They actually were a subcontractor for others, providing cocoa for C ration cans. They provided D ration bars in a 2-ounce variety for K rations. They also provided things like air crew lunches and also emergency rations, bailout rations, all kinds of things. Now, they did this with cocoa and sugar both being rationed and restricted for wartime use. In fact, Hershey, prior to the war, was producing 25 different products, and they were down to 6 commercial products during wartime. Reese's wasn't owned by Hershey yet, but was still producing products in town, had 12 products that it was producing pre-war, and was down to 1, the peanut butter cup, during the war because it produced the least amount of sugar. Things like tin cans for Hershey cocoa became cardboard. As I mentioned, the foil wrapping and the embossing of labels became glassine and became just printing. All of these things were done because of the war effort. So, in order to entice businesses the same way as civilians to participate in the war effort, the Army Navy E-Award Excellence in Production program was created to reward companies that went to extra efforts to produce and really participate in wartime mobilization. Of 85,000 companies across the United States that made some type of war material or contributed to the war effort, only 4,283 plants, or 5% of that total, earned an Army-Navy E-Efficiency Award. 426 companies in Pennsylvania earned at least one of these awards, and stars could be earned for continued good performance. Hershey eventually earned 5 total awards. The first was presented on August 27, 1942, in a ceremony right here where we stand. It contained people connected with the chocolate factory, including President William Murray, the dynamic duo that invented the D-ration bar, Sam Hinkle and Colonel Paul Logan, as well as an 85-year-old M.S. Hershey. Now, Hershey, who didn't speak very publicly very often at that time, had this to say: "If the bombs come, there is no age discrimination. So we should have the same right to live and fight for our country as any boy at the front. There is no age limit to serving our country." One of the 3,900 employees that packed the lawn was Ralph Light, who accepted the E Award pin on behalf of all employees. He had 5 sons in the military at the time, 4 of whom had worked at the chocolate company prior to joining the military. As the ceremony concluded and the signal and the whistle sound was the signal to get back to work as the factory hummed 24/7 at the time. Now, post-war, many people connected with Hershey and World War II continued to run the company. In the 1950s, Hinkle, who had taken Murray's place as president of the chocolate company and plant manager, became CEO. Again, chemist, inventor of the D-ration bar. As Murray steps aside, Hinkle brings in a group of so-called whiz kids, college-educated kids, most of whom are World War II veterans at the time. One of those was named Harold Moeller. And Moeller, who had been a navigator on a B-17 in Italy, was shot down and wounded, and also spent a year in a Luftstalag as a prisoner of the Germans, became the head of the Hershey Chocolate Company in the 1960s after Hinkle's retirement. Harold Moeller helped to modernize Hershey. He brought in whiz kids, college-educated, and World War II veterans, and it was their innovation that really took Hershey to the next level and is the Hershey that we know today. Succeeding Hinkle as president in 1965, product lines were expanded, innovation of new products, which Hershey had lagged at for years, diversification into other companies, and pasta were added. Discontinuation of the 5-cent bar, which had been a staple since 1903. It was truly a changing of the guard here, because you had these guys that were making decisions that others had, frankly, had been scared to do. You had a lot of tradition in the company that was tied back to what would Milton do. And Moeller kind of broke that tradition a little bit. Now, if you think about a lot of these guys who were World War II veterans and had faced not just life and death situations, but had served and sacrificed for so long and had seen hardships and suffering, you have to think that that fit into some of that post-war mentality of making hard decisions, because this may not have been the most critical or life-changing point for them, as World War II may have been. And so maybe it made some of those really difficult decisions a little bit easier based on what they had faced previously. Now, you had others in the 60s that began advertising and really, again, grew the company into what it is today. It was men like Harold Moeller. It was men like Bill Dearden, who would succeed Moeller as president of the chocolate company that we talked about up at the industrial school. It's men like John Rawley, Larry Johns, Bill Schuring, Earl Spangler, who became plant managers, director of marketing, revamped packaging, revamped store displays. And in addition to that, not only people like Moeller and Dearden, who shaped Hershey chocolate, but Gumpfer and Hatt, who shaped the other companies in town. All were World War II veterans and all created a legacy and continued what Milton Hershey had done so many years ago. As the war came to an end, Hershey not just celebrated the conclusion of hostilities, as they did with a parade on the occasion of Japanese surrender in August of 1945, was actually one of Milton Hershey's last public appearances, having died that October. But there were also many things to welcome the veterans back, such as a welcome home dinner in the Hershey dining room of the community building in February of 1945. There was a celebration in the stadium in September of 1946 that was a celebration of the lost. But in the fall of 1945, there was something that took place in Hershey that was a culmination of a lot of those feelings of joy, but also sorrow from the war. There was a war bond drive that was held, and it was featured the crew of the B-29 named after Hershey, called the City of Hershey. Now, they flew 25 missions with the 330th Bomb Group from Guam to Japan between April and August of 1945, helping to bring the war to a close. But they then returned and flew into Olmsted Air Base, came to Hershey in October and November of 1945 as part of a war bond drive. They had open houses where the public could come and visit the B-29 bomber, which was a marvel of the day. They visited both the high school and Hershey Industrial School, held a rally at the factory, and also attended an ice hockey game at the arena. Now, the reason the plane was named after Hershey was because they got to pick a name, and the navigator, Richard Rice, was from town. 3 others were from Pennsylvania that were on the crew, and they felt like they would get candy out of the deal if they named after Hershey. Well, they got better than that. They actually got to the Hershey Company itself, where they made the chocolate. Now, of the over 100 planes named after cities in that 330th Bomb Group, only 2 came back to hold war bond rallies as intended. Luckily, one was Hershey. We're back in the Hershey History Center in the Dick Winters display, which is Major Dick Winters' office from his home in Hershey, where he wrote things like Band of Brothers, Beyond Band of Brothers. Now, coming home wasn't always easy. They would always carry a piece of the war with them. Every veteran had their own way of trying to come to peace with their service. Some of them never did. There were times that they spent throughout the war that they just saw things. They saw people at their very best, at their very worst. They saw immense destruction, and they saw numerous occurrences of death, and it was just everywhere. It was unavoidable. There were, through 6 years of war, 47 countries were involved. 60 million people died during the war, soldiers and civilians. That's one death every 3 seconds for 6 straight years. In Hershey, 44 veterans gave their lives. And in some respects, as they came back stronger, but the war never left them. In some respects, the closer you are to death, the greater the joy you take in life, as war used men up very quickly. And so I want to end with a quote from Eugene Sledge, who served on Okinawa and wrote a famous memoir after the war. And his quote was, "You spent your time trying to live through the war, and if you survived, you spent the rest of your life trying to live with it." And I want to leave you with the thought of not just somebody like Dick Winters, who became a very famous veteran after the war, but think of those men and women in your own families, in your community, and think of all they went through to come back and to build stronger communities. Think about all of the things in your own hometown that the community organizations, businesses, churches, places like historical societies that have the fingerprints on it of these men and women, and think about how those organizations have thrived, and really the fingerprints of World War II veterans are on almost everything that has been done in those communities since the end of World War II. So I thank you for being a part of the World War II tour of Hershey, and I hope you enjoyed the ride.